So Hopkins and Yale have very good processes that they described on how they did things. And then we also looked at the universities studying slavery. So this is a consortium of universities studying slavery. There were about 66 of them at the time. I think they're up to about 100 now. And so we sat and we looked at all those, and it boiled down to basically three ways you could do a project like this. The first is to have students do it. And we really, really wanted to have our students involved in this historic research and writing these reports. But St. John's is a great books college with a mandatory curriculum, and we worked at this for a long while, and we finally just decided there was no way to make that work. So the second was to have your your college's history department work on it, the professors. We don't have a history department, so that was easy. And so we ended up going with a third party, an outside research company. Of course, that meant that we would have to pay them. So we put our grants writing team to work, and after about a year and a half, they were able to get a grant from the state of Maryland in the Maryland Historic Trust, which is the state historic preservation office, for a partial amount. And that was followed pretty quickly by the Franz Marek Foundation, which is a Baltimore-based family foundation, and they focus mainly on Baltimore, so they stretched to come down here to Annapolis. So I believe there are representatives of both groups here, and please join me in thanking them for their generosity in funding this effort. So we have found a vendor. They've started work. We've seen a first draft. We had some comments. We've asked them to make some changes. The state's going to make some changes. Then there's a review process. So we believe we'll receive that report sometime before the end of the year. And at that point, we want your recommendation, your comments on it. We really wanted to have this as a series of seminars after we got the report. And after considering it a lot, we realized it would just be a logistical nightmare to try and do that. So the same email address that people are using to send in comments tonight, please read the reports and send us comments when you get them, and we'll use those as we put together our recommendations for the board. I was asked to explain the Eisenhower photos in the lobby. So this building, Mellon Hall and Francis Scott Key Auditorium, were dedicated in 1958 by President Eisenhower. He flew in on a Marine One, landed on the soccer field, and walked in here and stood right about there and gave a speech. And I think the reason, I would like to say the reason was because the new program was founded to combat fascism, and by 1958 the focus had turned to combating communism. Haven't found any documentation to prove that, so it may be just that President Weigel knew somebody in the White House and convinced them to come by. But I'm going to keep looking, and I'm going to prove that. So I guess the last thing I want to say is, if you have a chance, please go to the College History Task Force page on our college website, and you'll see a short biography and a photo of each of the current and former members of the task force. And if you know any of them or you happen to pass by any of them, please stop and thank them for the work that they've done. And in particular, I want to thank three who started on day one with me and are still at it. And that is the librarian on our Santa Fe campus, Jennifer Sprague, Jordan Klein, who's here in our finance office, and the historian who I mentioned, Emily Murphy, who's up in Massachusetts. So please join me in thanking the College History Task Force volunteers, because they're all volunteers. And with that, I'll turn it back to Nora.
Thank you, Adrian. Before I introduce tonight's panel, I must acknowledge what is obvious, and that all of you have already noticed as you've looked at the stage for a little while. Myself, our task force chair, most of tonight's panelists, and indeed a large cross-section of the college community are white Americans. We chose our panel tonight because of their scholarly expertise and ability to speak to different aspects of Key's life. But it is extremely important to me and to our community that we elevate the voices of diverse groups and I hope that all members of the community feel welcome on our campus always, and encouraged to participate in this discussion tonight and beyond tonight, and ask questions. I also want to thank the History Task Force and Adrian's leadership who planned this event, and the College History Task Force does include a group with diverse races, genders, ages, and roles at the college. I also want to thank the college's community partners who engage with us on these issues and make us all better, including the Banneker-Douglass, soon-to-be-added Tubman Museum, the Martin Luther King Jr. Committee, and organizations of Hispanics, Latin Americans of Anne Arundel County. With that, it is now my honor and privilege to introduce tonight's panel. Our moderator is Janelle Compton Johnson. Ms. Johnson is the Executive Director for the Banneker-Douglass Tubman Museum and the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture. She's also a visual artist expressing Black diasporic experiences, history, and identity through portraits, abstract paintings, and mosaics. Mark CLAGUE, closest to me, serves as Professor of Musicology, Art Leadership, and American Culture at the University of Michigan's School of Music, Theater, and Dance, where he's also Editor-in-Chief of the George and Ira Gershwin Critical Edition. Professor CLAGUE's research focuses on the social power of music in American life. His book, Oh Say Can You Hear? A Cultural Biography of the Star-Spangled Banner, explores the forgotten history, changing meanings, and ongoing social function of the national anthem. MARC LEEPSON, closest to Ms. Johnson, is a journalist, historian, and author of 10 books, including What So Proudly We Hailed, Flag, An American Biography, and Lafayette, Idealist General. A former staff writer for Congressional Quarterly, he has written articles and reviews for many newspapers and magazines, and is the longtime senior writer, arts editor, and columnist for the VVA Veteran, the magazine published by Vietnam Veterans of America. William Thomas is the Engel Chair in the Humanities and Professor of History at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He was co-founder and director of the Virginia Center for Digital History at the University of Virginia. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow and is the winner of the 2021 Linton History Prize for A Question of Freedom, the families who challenged slavery from the nation's founding to the Civil War. He is a co-producer, co-founder, and screenwriter for Animating History, a series of award-winning animated films, and worthwhile watching whatever age group you fall into. Books by our panelists are available in the College Bookstore and the Greenfield Library for anyone interested in learning more after our panel. To all of our panelists, thank you for traveling to our campus and for being with us tonight. And now I turn the floor over to Ms. Johnson.
Can y'all hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. How's everybody doing?
Good.
Good. I first want to give a special thank you to Nora Dimleitner. She is thebomb.com. She's an incredible president of this university. She's a great partner to the Banneker-Douglass Museum. And she's an amazing thought leader on many topics. So thank you, Nora, for your generosity. And I do want to give a shout out also to your amazing staff, Sarah and Bruce, for corralling me to get here. They were incredible to work with. So your staff is awesome as well. Thank you to the Historic Committee Task Force for putting this event together. I do want to give a special thank you to Martina Dodd, who's our Curator of Collections of the Banneker-Douglass Museum. Raise your hand, Martina. Before I get started, I think it's important to note that both institutions are partnering together. The Banneker-Douglass Museum is a partner on your soon-to-be archival project to examine and make publicly accessible the 300-plus year archive of this university. So thank you. So on behalf of the Banneker-Douglass Museum, your state museum on African American history and culture, and the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture, I'm incredibly honored to moderate this discussion with such an impressive panel of historians who will share their experiences and research on the history surrounding the life and legacy of Francis Scott Key. This is y'all should know this because we're in Maryland. This is an incredible milestone year for Maryland. It is 2024 is the 60th anniversary of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. It is also the 160th anniversary for Maryland emancipation. It's an election year. And we're leading into our sesquicentennial, our 250th anniversary of our state and nation's founding. The examination of political power, freedom, and democracy is nothing new to our state, and definitely nothing new to St. John's College. Through the lens of three distinct historians, we will explore Francis Scott Key's life and work as a vehicle to understanding resistant movements from the American Revolution to the anti-slavery movement and the dichotomy of power and oppression in American democracy. My sincere hope is that everyone participating tonight will leave a bit more inspired to learn more about their own family and community history, to learn and grow from our past. So y'all ready? Yeah, okay. So let's begin. All right. My first question is for the bunch, and I know there's two Marks on the panel. So if I'm looking at you, you know I'm talking to you, Mark. And if I'm looking at you, you know I'm talking to you, Mark.
Well, his name is with a C and I'm with a K, so you just pronounce it slightly differently.
Exactly.
It'll be good.
Well, my first question is for the bunch. Can you share your journey in exploring and interpreting the life and history surrounding Francis Scott Key? Specifically, what inspired you to write about him, and what impact has this research had on you personally?
Are you talking to me?
I'm talking to you, Mark.
I love answering that question, so thank you. I wrote a book that came out in 2005 called Flag, an American Biography, which is a history of the American flag. And as I was doing it, when I got to the Star-Spangled Banner, I tried to, find the best sources about Francis Scott Key, and I saw that the most recent biography came out in 1937. So that little nugget squirreled away in my head. I went on to write another book after that, and when I came to think about my next book, 2014 was coming up. So I thought, it's good to have a tie-in, and originally thought about writing something about the year 1914, which is one of the most amazing years in world history, but I realized everybody had written about everything about that year. So then what about 1814? And then I remembered that there hadn't been a biography of Key. So I talked to my agent, and my literary agent, he and I, it's always a discussion about our next book. He once told me that the ideas that I had for books were the worst he'd heard in 30 years of publishing. However, he didn't believe me that there wasn't a biography of Key since 1937, and then when he found out, he agreed, so I went through the process and wrote it. And I have to tell you, I taught U.S. history, community college, and I have a fair knowledge of history. Only thing I knew about Francis Scott Key was that he wrote the words that will become the Star-Spangled Banner. So it was a journey for me when I got into it. I had no idea that he enslaved people, nor his family did. I had no idea that he was a big lawyer in Washington, D.C., that he was a U.S. attorney for 8 years in the nation's capital, that he argued over 100 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, including some that are still studied in law school today. He was a great persuader. He had the gift of gab. He swayed juries. We won't get into the Star-Spangled Banner, how that happened, but that had to do with the fact.
We'll talk about that later.
Yeah, but just to say that it had to do with his lawyerly skills. So I learned a lot about him, and also, and I hope that we talk about colonization, because I had very limited knowledge about the American Colonization Society. That was a big part of. Oh, by the way, I want you to come away with this knowing something new about Francis Scott Key. They called him Frank, okay? Found it in the letters, our dear Frank. So we're going to call him Frank for the rest of the evening, if that's okay. The real name of the bridge really is the Frank Key. No, it isn't, sorry. But colonization, right. So he was a founding member of the American Colonization Society. He was a strong proponent of it. He to his dying day, he gave speeches, he wrote articles, and that was a big part of his life. And I think I'll leave it at that, because I think that's germane to the subject for now.
I'm sorry, brief, because I know historians love to talk. But briefly, can you talk about what has this research had on you, if you have one example, had on you personally, like any personal revelations that you've had with researching this person?
Well, you know, I'm a historian, and I'm trying to get at the facts, right? And, but, you know, okay, the biggest personal thing I had, of course I knew that he enslaved people. And it's one thing to know it, then it's another thing to read a letter that he wrote to his father saying, oh, by the way, I have a young girl, age 8, who I think be perfect for Mama's kitchen, and her, and you know, a strong man. And then, you know, for some reason that hit me more than anything else. It personalized it. It wasn't just words on a page. I could really picture that. So I think that's the thing that hit me the most personally.
Thank you. William?
Why don't you go?
Okay. Thank you. I had a very different pathway into this research and into this subject. I didn't set out to write a biography of Francis Scott Key. I started researching a Supreme Court case called Queen v. Hepburn, and it came before the Supreme Court in 1813, and I was surprised to see Francis Scott Key was the lawyer who argued the case in front of the Supreme Court, and the case was a freedom suit. It was a petition for freedom by an enslaved woman and her daughter, Mina and Louisa Queen, against a slaveholder in Washington, D.C. And so when I set out to learn more about this case, first of all, I didn't know that there were freedom suits in American history that early, and I'm a card-carrying historian, certified. But I, of course, knew about Dred Scott, and I'm sure you do too, know about that case. But that's much later, right before the Civil War, and here this was in 1813, and Francis Scott Key, the lawyer, was making an argument before the Supreme Court on behalf of this enslaved family suing for their freedom. And so that's where I started out, and one of my first research trips on this was down to UVA to look at the papers there, letters that Key wrote right around this period, right in the 1810, 1813 period. And the truth is, I sort of started with, you know, what I was familiar with, which was Key and Key's world, the world of law, the world of white slaveholders. And I didn't really understand at that point what I would need to learn and go through in order to tell this story of what happened in Maryland and what happened here with slavery. And the archival silences that surround Black history to this day. So there were letters by Francis Scott Key, but none of those letters referred to the Queen family or to the freedom suits or really even to slavery very clearly. And so I think, honestly, I had to get past the idea of Key as a heroic lawyer and really see what was happening in these cases and to see slavery as it was. He was definitely a zealous advocate as a lawyer for his clients, but the family's like the Queens, enslaved families who sued for freedom, hundreds of them suing here in Maryland, I later discovered, right here in Annapolis, at the State House where the General Court of the Western Shore met, right here, less than a block from here. Hundreds of cases coming before that court. The Butler family, the Shorter family, the Queen family, the Snowdens, and many, many others. They were at the center of their story, and this story of American freedom, and Key was not at the center of that story. And that realization gradually inspired me to try to recount this in a question of freedom and wrestle with and reckon with this history. One final comment about this. You asked what inspired. Key made some inspiring arguments in the Supreme Court, as Mark just said, that are still studied today. The Antelope case, for example, calling slavery a violation of natural law and calling the slave trade illegal under international law. And in some of those cases, as a zealous advocate, as a lawyer, he speaks to the highest ideals of the law. But I don't think, as I look at the historical record, Key did much, or of anything, to attempt to end slavery in the United States, or to call for its abolition, or even its gradual abolition. And this moral failure is something I wanted to reckon with in the book, and to try, because I just kept thinking about it. What inhumanities, what injustices are we failing to see in our own time? And are we failing to address in our own time? And so the impact, to answer your question, on me has been profound. And part of that has been reckoning with my own family's history of enslavement in Prince George's County, Maryland, the Duckett family, and I write about that in A Question of Freedom. It's woven into this history of the freedom suits. So, I've been both inspired by this history, but also deeply troubled and wanting to reckon with the moral failure at the center of it, and to try and do so in a way that recognizes that we need new stories. We need to fashion a narrative around stories that we've left out of the historical narrative to this point. That's what I took from my experience.
Thank you, William. Mark?
Well, thanks so much, and thank you, Chanel, for getting us started and for taking on the moderator role. And I'm really delighted to be here, in part to be at St. John's, where discourse and sort of taking on challenging issues that don't have clear answers sometimes is part of the fabric of the institution. I'm also thrilled to be here with Mark and Will, in part because I built my work in part on top of theirs. And we have talked on the phone many, many times, but I actually had never met either of them in person. So this is really exciting for me. I'm a music historian, focus on the history of music in the United States. And so my journey with Francis Scott Key starts with Jimi Hendrix, 1969 in Woodstock. And I've, for many years, taught a course, an introduction to American music, that had been taught by my mentor. And so I wanted to do something a little different. I wanted to get my students talking, debating about the meaning of music, which often, we know is delightful and beautiful and sort of helps us maybe exercise or dance, but we sometimes don't think about very deeply about the words or what the music means to us as individuals, as people. And so Hendrix for me was a sort of open sesame. I would play a video clip from the Woodstock film, and if you know that film, Hendrix's set is the final set of the festival, and he actually announces that he's going to close the set, and then he starts to play the Star-Spangled Banner, seemingly like out of this ecstatic improvisation. And so my main question to my students was, well, what is American music exactly? So the anthem must be American music, since it's the national anthem. And what is this performance? What's going on that an African-American man can play the Star-Spangled Banner at a countercultural festival in 1969 on an electric guitar. And what does it mean that he departs from the melody and has these sort of ecstatic, psychedelic improvisations? And so I wanted them to really practice close listening. And then, of course, being students, they started asking me more questions about, well, where did this song come from? And who is this Francis Scott Key guy? And what did it all mean? And I had, a little bit like Mark talked about it, a very sort of, rudimentary, sort of American patriotic, bicentennial kind of education. I was 9 years old in 1976 at the bicentennial, and I think I imbibed a very simplistic, optimistic view of what America was, very commercial view of what America was. And sort of American idealism was sort of planted in me. And so in many ways, this became a very personal quest to understand my relationship to this song and to this feeling that somehow this song was a good song and a proud song and a song that somehow said something about me. And I wanted to understand that more deeply. And like often happens with history, as you start to look into it, you fall into this very, very deep hole very, very quickly. And it turned out, for instance, one of the big surprises in my research, which to be honest became slightly annoying after a while, was that I would find these other words that had been written to the tune we know as the Star-Spangled Banner. And so every time I found one, I had to stop what I was doing and go to my database and enter all the details and all the citations and all the things that historians do, because if you find something and you can't cite it later, it's like you never found it, right? And so I found over 630 of these things in my research over about 10 years. And so what I came to realize is this song, this melody, became deeply embedded with American identity as early as the 1790s. And that the resonance it had became a vehicle for commentary, not unlike Hendrix talking at Woodstock, right? That this was a time of division, that it was a time of angst, that he was literally singing the Vietnam War and the race riots and violence and oppression that he experienced and witnessed. When he played the anthem, it was almost like he was taking a picture of the world around him, which was interesting at Woodstock in particular, because it turned out that Hendrix played the Star-Spangled Banner at least 70 times during his career. People usually only know about Woodstock. But at Woodstock, it's a particular version that in some ways became iconic because it was in the movie and it got replayed and was put out on CD. The other versions that I found are almost all on audience tapes that were kept by people who were just recordists. And at Woodstock, he was actually in some ways feeling very optimistic, very patriotic, because he saw the youth of America sort of taking over, bringing a new vision for what the country could be. And so here was this festival that was, sort of overrun by all these people, and it was going to be a public health disaster and all these problems. And yet people pulled together and supported one another, and they seemed to offer a new vision of possibility. So there's a way in which the Woodstock anthem is also very optimistic. I mean, it's sort of in time, in tune. If you listen to that video, which is now super valuable. I used to be cool with my students because I had one of the few video copies. I'm not cool anymore. That ship sailed. Yes, exactly. It's all over YouTube. But if you watch that video when you get home, and I recommend you do, because to me it's one of the most profound statements of sort of American meaning and the struggle about being American that's ever been voiced. But if you say the words to yourself, you realize as he's playing that he's singing the song, singing the words on his electric guitar strings. And where the sort of ecstatic improvisations happen is with the bombs and the rockets, right? He's sort of depicting Vietnam. And a little known thing about Hendrix is that he had been in the 101st Airborne, right? So he had his Screaming Eagles patch. He had many friends who were in Vietnam. And so for him, this was a very personal thing. It was not just a knee-jerk political thing, or he was not just following the crowd. He was really, I think, struggling with what it meant for him to be American, and he was giving voice to that through the song. So I think, in a way, my journey with writing the book was also a very personal journey, was to try to figure out what my relationship was to America and to this history that became increasingly dissonant from what that 9-year-old boy experienced, up through as I began to study and became more aware of all the people we were leaving out of the story. And so I think I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, thank you. My second question is for William. Is it Will or William? What do you want?
I go by Will.
Will? Okay,
Yeah.
we're gonna say Will. Okay. Your book shares the stories of families in Maryland who petitioned for their freedom and filed lawsuits against their slaveholders. Your book centers African Americans in Maryland who empowered themselves, used their own political and legal expertise and their own networks to fight for their own liberation. Your book also dismantles the white savior trope of figures like Francis Scott Key, who as a lawyer had represented lawsuits on behalf of the enslaved and the enslaver. This question can literally be a panel series in and of itself, but do the best you can, keep it concise. But can you share the African American families, most notably the Queen family's relationship and how they came to work with Francis Scott Key?
Sure. That's a fascinating and important question, because when I pulled the case file of the Queen v. Hepburn freedom suit at the National Archives, I knew nothing about the families, the history, about Key, really. But immediately I saw in the case file a series of depositions, witness statements, taken 20 years earlier in Annapolis, Maryland, and some up and down the Western Shore and even some on the Eastern Shore in Cecil County. And these depositions came from, I didn't know it at the time, came from freedom suits that I mentioned a moment ago that were filed here in the General Court of the Western Shore. And the General Court of the Western Shore met in the State House. I want to come back to that maybe later on. But the Queen family and other families, the Butlers in particular, found attorneys here in Annapolis, Samuel Chase at first, who then became a judge of the Supreme Court. He was also chief judge of the Maryland High Court. And then Gabriel Duval, most significantly, who represented more than 120 enslaved families in Maryland right here in Annapolis. His offices were over here, with Philip Barton Key. Key and Duval handled most of the initial freedom suits by the Butlers and the Queens. Eventually, Philip Barton Key, that is Francis Scott Key's uncle, when Francis Scott Key was a student here at St. John's, he was, I don't know, clerking, I would say. He was kind of studying law also and helping Philip Barton Key here in the 1790s. And most of these freedom suits, they begin in the 1780s here in Maryland.
I'm sorry, and Key, that was his uncle?
His uncle,
okay.
Philip Barton Key, is a lawyer, prominent lawyer, eventually a congressman and also a judge, a federal judge. He's here in Annapolis. He at first is allied with Gabriel Duval, and the two of them handle these early freedom suits. And so when Key was a student at St. John's, I would think that, yes, he knew about the freedom suits of the Queens. He knew about the freedom suits of the Butlers. These were prominent and important cases in 1793, 1794, the Queen's case in 1794, the Mahoney family's case in 1795, Charles Mahoney, and then 1796. So Key's pathway into the law really is occurring at this very same moment, and I think that's how Key comes to represent the Queens in Washington, D.C. They either are taken forcibly by enslavers to Washington, D.C., or, and I think we need to think about this, that they, with their legal knowledge, managed to get themselves to Washington, D.C., where there's a new district, a new court, a new jurisdiction, that they can bring the same freedom suits in front of that U.S. court. It's a circuit court. Congress chartered it, right, in 1801, new jurisdiction, and it's a jurisdiction where Maryland law applies, okay, on the Maryland side of the district. Virginia law applied on the other side. So, the Philip Barton Key is at first I think the key part of this, and then the families certainly know Francis Scott Key.
Mark.
Yes.
Key is known as a national, I just want to go back, I'm so sorry,
Yeah,
William.
okay.
If you haven't, get all of their books, okay? I would say reading your book, I've worked at the Prince George's African American Museum. Reading case by case the lawsuits that African Americans were a part of to liberate themselves,
Yes.
but it wasn't this, you didn't frame it as the white lawyers liberating
Right.
these African Americans, but African Americans leading their own liberation.
Right.
Right. So it was definitely a fascinating read. Mark, because we didn't do this in the beginning, so my bad. But as far as talking about just an overview of Francis Scott Key's life and who he was, Key is known as a national hero to many, and there has been a very polarizing response to the proposed renaming of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. In your book, you explore Key's journey as a husband, a father, a lawyer, a politician, a slaveholder, a mediocre poet that would write the words to our national anthem. Can you talk about his life and Key's evolving viewpoint on freedom, right? And what shaped his thinking of freedom, particularly the freedom of African Americans throughout his life?
Yeah, well, good question. And, not only did he enslave people, but, his grandfather was one of, Southern Maryland, slavery was rampant there. So, I think it was ingrained in him, from childhood, right? He grew up in north of Frederick, Maryland, a land that his other grandfather had bought and he inherited. It was basically a plantation. And he had one sister, and they were kind of pampered in that bosom of, privilege and with enslaved people taking care of their needs. Then they shipped him off here when he was, 10 years old?
10,
maybe?
I think.
10.
Yeah.
Because St. John's.
To St. John's.
Yeah, because it wasn't just a college then. And he, read law, and like Philip Barton Key, his uncle was a part of it. And, the thing is, if you're dealing with the early republic, I think somebody mentioned it earlier, you can't get away from slavery. It's beneath the surface, politically, socially, or not even beneath. It's there. And so he was enmeshed in it. I concentrated on, his legal career because that's what he did for a living. The other part of it has to do with religion. So he was extremely pious. If you read his letters, he had 11 children. Several of his daughters moved, so there's a lot of letters between father and daughter. If you can decipher his handwriting, you can get a lot out of him. Although he didn't, he didn't discuss slavery hardly at all. But they were always suffused with, be sure to follow the path of the Bible, and he would put biblical verses. In fact, he almost became an Episcopal priest. There's a letter, I found a letter between him, letters back and forth between him and the Archbishop of Maryland in Baltimore, who's saying, you should join the priesthood. And he said, well, no, I have a family to feed. But he was very religious. He was sort of a lay preacher in Washington. He once baptized a child. He taught Sunday school. Yeah, so I think, can I get colonization in here too? Because
definitely.
I think that...
And can you explain what that is? Because not everybody knows what the American colony is.
So there was something called the American Colonization Society. It started in 1816 in Washington, D.C. Frank was one of the founding members, and like I said earlier, he was on the board of directors, and he was a strong proselytizer for it. The idea was to send, not enslaved people, but free people, free black people, to a new colony on the west coast of Africa that would become Liberia. And it was basically every politician except for the abolitionists in the North signed on to it. It was extremely accepted, all the Southern politicians did. And they didn't bother checking with the African chiefs, by the way. And it had a strong religious component to it. They were, in their literature, they talk about how this would be civilizing the black people who were sent over there. And the other thing is, Key claimed that that would be a way to end, not slavery so much, but international slave trafficking, which had been illegal since, 1808? But, of course, it was going on. So, it's, in a way, you can see maybe why this would... It wasn't very popular among free people. Believe me, there were like riots in the streets of Philadelphia at one point against it. But enough went over there. And I think and Mark, I think, has talked about this too, about did he really think that he was civilizing, quote unquote, black people? Did he really think he was going to, what did he really think? It's a question that doesn't have a true answer in my brain. So, but he was so involved with it to this dying day. And, at first abolitionists were kind of like the idea. Well, free people giving them a new chance. They soured on it very quickly. And Frank and abolitionists were at loggerheads for the rest of his life. So I don't know if I'm edging around the answer to your question, but did I nibble close enough to it?
Yeah, so you mentioned something, he didn't speak about slavery, or he didn't write about it. But there is documentation of him obviously speaking about it in the courtroom and on the public stage. Can you talk about, did he have a varying viewpoint of American slavery from the beginning of his career, or even his political career, to the end of his political career? Because he has a very charged statement that he made at 57, where he states, as a lawyer, I always undertook these cases. He's speaking of the cases to free enslaved people. I always undertook these cases with peculiar zeal and have been thus instrumental in liberating several large families and many individuals. I cannot remember more than 2 instances. Mind you, he tried I don't want to say tried, but he represented over 100 cases. Yeah. Okay.
104.
I'm sorry?
104.
104, excuse me. I cannot remember more than 2 instances out of this large number in which it did not appear that the freedom I so earnestly sought for them was their ruin. So, Can you talk, maybe, was there kind of like an evolution of how he perceived black freedom or black liberation? Like, he went from representing these cases, and it could have, William, you talk about it in your book, right, as it being, I'm paraphrasing, almost like political theater. Can we kind of like unpack that? And I'm opening up to the...
Let me say one thing real quick, and then I want to point. I'm going to punt. Okay. But don't forget, he was a lawyer in private practice and prosecuting attorney.
Yeah.
So we're talking about civil suits,
Right.
we're talking about prosecutions. And just two things really quickly. You know, he went out of his way to prosecute a young white abolitionist for possessing abolitionist tracts.
Oh, yeah.
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 And,
And that was where he stated this.
Yes.
was
That
that
quote.
was
That quote
okay.
was in that trial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I'll punt that one over to you.
Yeah.
So just show us
Well,
to sort of
this is-
differentiate, sorry, between the being prosecutor and being
a
private
district attorney.
lawyer. Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is one of the hardest questions to answer about Francis Scott Key is, do his views change over time, right? That's what you're asking. And it's tempting to think that he begins his career as a kind of revolutionary in favor of freedom, in favorem libertatis, the principle, the legal principle, leaning in, that the law should lean in favor of freedom. And it's tempting to think that Key is zealous in his advocacy in freedom suits because he really believes that slavery should be dismantled. But I urge us to take care with our analysis here and really think about the evidence we have. And there is an element of humanitarian and religious Episcopalianism that drives Key here in this period, for sure. And it is also true that he is never an anti-slavery figure in the full meaning of that word, and he's never an abolitionist at all. And as abolitionism expands in the 1830s, Key voices those sentiments you just quoted in response to, so the political terrain changes, and Key disavows the freedom suits that he's participated in and argues that black Americans, including those that he represented, all but, what did you say, two out of 100, all but 2 out of 100 have failed in their freedom. It's a racist depiction of the failure of black freedom. And it's politically the world Key inhabits. His brother-in-law is Roger Taney, who ascends to the Chief Justiceship of the Supreme Court in 1836, the year before that quote. So I think the answer to your question is the politics shift, and that's one thing, and that we don't want to misread Key's humanitarian impulses, which are strong and come from his religious zeal and fervor, and we don't want to misunderstand that as somehow specifically anti-slavery or abolitionist in the earlier period, right? There are other reasons Key represents freedom seekers. It helps his legal career. He can try out ideas because many of these freedom suits had to do with property matters, contract, deeds of manumission, and very technical aspects of the law. And so there's also the self-regard that Key derived from representing people who needed help or kidnapped free blacks who, from Delaware or Pennsylvania, who he saw as truly wrongly enslaved, right? So it is complicated, but I think the transition you're looking at is in both the fact that he's the U.S. attorney and prosecuting an abolitionist, Reuben Crandall, and prosecuting him for seditious libel, as if the First Amendment, and it wasn't clear, frankly, whether the First Amendment applied or whether there was a common law libel tradition that he could prosecute for. So he prosecutes abolitionists and he disavows the freedom suits, and that is in response to the rise of abolitionism in American society. And Key, by that point, is a Jacksonian Democrat, and he knows it.
Thank you to the other Mark. As we're talking about evolution or the lack thereof, can you share what inspired Keyes to write the words to the Star-Spangled Banner? And can you give examples, as you have in your book, of how and why this anthem has been at times weaponized, reinterpreted, and reimagined throughout American history? You don't got to go through your whole book, just some.
No, I think one of the things that probably all of us have, if we asked you why did Francis Scott Key write the anthem, we probably all could give a sort of basic answer of that. And part of it is because it's sort of in the text, right? That he's like, oh, say, can you see the flag? And there's this battle going on, and then there's this huge relief where the flag is still there and sort of marking this moment that saved America. So I think, one thing about this tradition, which to us today is pretty much long forgotten, of writing new lyrics to old tunes. This was a way of commenting on political happenings, daily life, like personal happenings. There are all sorts of these 620 lyrics. Some of them are like a lyric that a husband writes to his wife for their anniversary. There are advertisements for stores. There are a lot of temperance songs. There are a lot of political campaign songs for president. There are a lot of 4th of July songs. That's sort of the 4th of July lyric was sort of the first thing that connects that tune to American patriotism. And one of the remarkable things is that Francis Scott Key actually wrote another set of lyrics to exactly the same melody 9 years earlier in 1805, celebrating the sort of naval heroes of the Tripolitan War in North Africa, right? So Charles Stewart and Stephen Decatur, called When the Warrior Returns. So it's exactly the same melody. It's when the warrior returns from the battle afar. Same as, oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light. I hear
Same
that every
line.
student here sings, so I think it's okay for me to share my lack of talent. Since
It also
we
has
should
the
all do
words
it.
Star-Spangled Banner in it.
What's it?
It also has the words Star-Spangled
It has the word Star-Spangled, yeah. It says
Star-Spangled,
Star-Spangled Flag of our nation. So basically, what happens with Key is that, and the opening chapter of my book takes this in excruciating detail and builds on work that Mark had done and another scholar named Steve Vogel, and really tries to trace like the blow by blow, almost in a cinematic way of what happened. And he's basically negotiating a prisoner release with the British. He's on aboard a ship in the Chesapeake, and they had finished a month earlier burning the federal buildings in Washington, D.C. Key was at that battle. He had volunteered for the militia to protect his home in Georgetown. And this was probably the most ignominious moment in American military history, right? A foreign force coming into the nation's capital and basically defeating it in a matter of an hour or so. The defenders sort of turned tail and running at Bladensburg, which is sometimes called the Bladensburg Races. And so a month later, he's negotiating the release of a prisoner, William Baines, who had been taken prisoner in the aftermath of that battle in Washington, and sort of overhears, apparently, the discussions for the attack on Baltimore. And so he's returned to his American truce ship. So one of the things my book does is try to take on certain mythologies around the Star-Spangled Banner, and one of them is that he's on a British ship held prisoner. He's actually on his own American truce ship. If you've seen that famous picture sort of depicting the moment where he sees the flag, he's like standing right next to a cannon. You don't put a cannon on a truce ship. It's very threatening to show up with armed. So it was an unarmed truce vessel with a white flag flying from it. But he watches the battle for Baltimore and pretty much thinks that Baltimore's going to fall just like Washington fell a month before. And the British are very confident. And the sort of miracle is that Baltimoreans rose up and defended the city. And basically, there was a land assault as well as a sea bombardment, and it's the sea bombardment that really Key is watching. So that's the bombs bursting in air, the rockets' red glare, going overnight, and he, of course, can't see the flag over the fort during the night, and so what gives proof through the night is the fact that the flags and bombs are still being fired, right? So if the British had taken the fort and were about to defeat Baltimore, they would stop firing on the fort. So the fact that they're still firing means that America still has a chance. And so it's that next morning, he sees the the flag, and he knows that the nation has been saved. This is before cell phones. There's no Twitter or X or anything you can do to find out what had happened. So Key's actually in a very information-poor environment. He doesn't actually really know much of what's happened other than the flag is still there. But he does know that this has been a momentous moment in American history, and one of the things you would do at that time is to write a set of words to be sung to this melody associated with American heroism that he had used before to mark this next pivotal moment. And so he writes, basically cribs from himself. He sort of copies some of the lyrics from the song he wrote in 1805 and updates it. And one of the other myths about it is, I think the way it's often represented in American history is this sort of flash of inspiration, and this patriotic fervor overcomes him, and he just sort of has this, whips out an envelope from his pocket and sort of writes down a few notes, and it's all there. In fact, he's sort of stuck on that boat for 2.5 days. He's with John Stuart Skinner, who's the U.S. agent of prisoner exchange and who is liaising with the British after the battle. Remember that the Americans are completely outgunned, so they've prevented the British from taking over Baltimore, but the British there's no way for the Americans really to fight back, so they can take their time, sort of getting the ships ready to sail. They've decided that it's really too costly to take Baltimore, and they sort of give up. They don't really get defeated. It's just that the defenders of Fort McHenry, against all odds, have stuck to their posts, basically. And so the original title of the lyric that we know as the Star-Spangled Banner is actually Defense of Fort McHenry, and it's really talking about those defenders. And so Key is responding to that moment. But he's writing a propaganda piece. He's not writing a purely patriotic, he's writing sort of his own journey over the war. He was first against the war, and then when the British threatened his home, he sort of reluctantly got involved with the war. But he saw a nation that was really weak, that didn't have a navy, for instance. The Naval Academy wasn't here yet, so there was a very weak navy. We couldn't get the British off our shores, right, for the entire summer of 1814. And so he was sort of calling on a time, in American history of incredible political division, in a way not all that unlike the 60s or today, and sort of telling people to come together. And so that lyric is sort of meant to inspire people to come together. And it sort of catches fire because the fact that this, the war sort of turns at that moment, right? The Battle of New Orleans is about a year later, and Britain is defeated, and this sort of notion of the nation itself, the idea of America, of American patriotism, in a sense, is born at this time. One of the interesting facts about this time is that the American flag, which we hold in such reverence today, was not an important symbol in 1814. It was the symbol, it was above the fort, but it was basically only the Navy that cared about the flag. At that point, there were 15 stars on the flag, and there were 18 states, and no one cared that they didn't match. Right? Today, if like Puerto Rico becomes a state and we sort of refuse to put the 51st star on the flag, there'd be a problem, right? In 1814, it was not a big deal. There were no flags in schoolrooms. Like, people didn't have flags in their homes. It was not a particularly important symbol. But that moment, the War of 1812, sort of Uncle Sam, the flag, the song, like all of that stuff sort of is birthed at that moment. And in a sense, this notion of the national strength, the federal strength of the country, rather than being a separate group of states, sort of is sparked at that moment.
So, okay, it became legislated in the 1930s as our national anthem, but you mentioned Jimi Hendrix's interpretation of the national anthem and how he was inspired by what was going on socially, culturally, and politically in the 1970s, and how that inspired this reinterpretation of the Star-Spangled Banner throughout history. And I sent you all, I don't know if you looked at it, but Jill Scott's interpretation, reimagining of the Star-Spangled Banner. If you have not heard it, go on YouTube and listen to that song, where she is singing the Star-Spangled Banner from the perspective of a Black person, specifically an enslaved Black person. So she reworked the lyrics, and it was incredibly powerful. Now, this is in 2024? I don't know when she wrote it, but she performed it in 2023, I think. can you give times in American history where the Star-Spangled Banner has been reinterpreted to broaden this idea and concept of what it means to be American? Like any special moments in your book that you would like to illuminate for us?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And, I think part of what happens in the 19th century is that people, when they want to comment on the nation through the song, they change the words. In the 20th century, we have the invention of recording with Edison in 1877, right? So performances can now travel as individual acts, that incredible artists do. We don't really know how it was performed so much in the 19th century. It was probably quite a bit quicker. It was initially a song of celebration. It wasn't the sacred national anthem. In 1814, it was a party song. Hey, we beat the British. Who can believe it? This is amazing, right? So it was probably quite a bit quicker. It's the original tempo in the sheet music is con spirito, or with spirit, whereas today it would be a much more reverent. It's almost like a church hymn today. So, one of the performances, Whitney Houston at the Super Bowl, is one of the ones that's often marked as maybe the greatest performance of the Star-Spangled Banner, the most inspiring. And of course, it was 1991. It's the first Gulf War. There's sort of a moment of real tension and anxiety in the country, and that war, seems to be a huge triumph for America. And there's a sense of, I think, of American exceptionalism, and all those sort of narratives come back with Whitney Houston. But what's interesting about Whitney Houston's version is that she actually sings musically what's a very untraditional version of the anthem, right? So the tune is initially in 3/4, and apologies for the technical jargon about music, but like a waltz is in 3, like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And the original Star-Spangled Banner is in 3. It's, oh, say, can you see by that 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And so there's this kind of rollicking, rolling kind of momentum that's built up, which has this kind of energy of celebration originally. And when Whitney sings it in 1991, she actually adds an extra beat. So it's, oh, say, can you see 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. And for a musician, that is really radical. That's like a waltz scoring an extra foot. Like it's really strange. But musically, what it does is it, I think, shows a transformation of the social function of the song. So the song starts off as a song of victory, and it becomes a sacred hymn to the nation, right? So when you add that extra beat, you basically turned it into a church hymn, right? So this kind of sacred nature of it comes to the fore. And in my book, I trace that really to 1861 and the beginning of the Civil War, and the way in which the flag, because the stars don't come off the flag, becomes the symbol of union and is made sacred through the sacrifices of life that preserve the union. And so the song and the flag sort of become supercharged as American symbols throughout the Civil War, as a kind of a rallying cry for the North and the Union Army. But I do think that one of the things that's interesting about the 20th century is that one of the things that's interesting about a song compared to a flag is that the flag, the symbol, sort of stays the same. And the song has to be performed. It has to be brought to life by a performer in real time. And so like Hendrix or Whitney Houston, there's a way in which the tune sort of takes on the resonance of the contemporary moment, and it starts to change and be something that's maybe different from what it was in Francis Scott Key's day, or even different than what it was for us last week, right? That it really sort of becomes of the moment, and it takes a kind of physical commitment to time and attention and performance to sing the song, right? And so the kind of heroism that's necessary to hit all those high notes, I think, gets enacted ritually through performance. And so I think the song is continually made anew, and it becomes a kind of protest. So Jill Scott, again, gives it a sense of her moment, right after George Floyd's murder, and the way in which the country is reckoning with that racial history, which, pretty much up through 2014, the 200th anniversary of the song, like, nobody was talking about. I mean, for me, it was Colin Kaepernick's protest in 2016 that said, wait a minute, I need a chapter about this. This, the word slave that's in the third verse, that needs to be discussed. Mm-hmm. Whereas literally nobody talked about it prior to that. It just was like politely ignored. And there's a way in which that reflects all of American history. We just sort of, all those things that we weren't proud of, we just sort of left out of the story. And all those people who had been silenced, we didn't want to hear from them. And so one of the things I think that's so powerful about struggling with the story of Key and what did he actually think and what did he say and how can he do work on this side of the ledger and that side of the ledger at the same time? It doesn't make any sense, right? To me, that's sort of all of American history. I mean, you have this era where slavery is legal, where white supremacy is the sort of foundational ideology of the entire society, right? Everybody who has political power, which is just white men, right? It all buys into that system. And so one of the important things I think about struggling with this story is the need to remember that part of our history. And if we forget that part of our history, we've really lost a lot.
Remembering, first of all, I did not know that about Whitney. Did y'all know that about the song?
It's an awesome performance. You got to watch that on YouTube.
Yeah. I miss her. So when we're talking about Francis Scott Key and his relationship with American democracy, right? In his autobiography, and this question is for you, Mark. In your autobiography of Francis Scott Key, you state, by all accounts, Keyes treated his own slaves humanely and freed several during his lifetime. What's more, he earned a deserved reputation for providing free legal advice to impoverished blacks in Washington, which we talked about earlier. Can you unpack this definition? And this isn't the first time I've heard this, but can you unpack this definition of treating his own slaves humanely? Can you give context to that statement? Also, is there any evidence from those that, and this is for the panel as well, is there any evidence from those that he enslaved of how they were treated by Key and or his family?
Yeah, I wish there were. We get it through the lens of letters. The other thing is, it wasn't like they had, it was a giant plantation with overseers. I mean, they were people who worked domestic work in Georgetown, and then they still had the place out in Terra Rubra outside of. That's why I said from all accounts. You know what I mean? I mean, we know just what Mark said. Who wrote it was who had access to it. So, again, all of it is nuanced too. Yes, he did manumit a couple of I think 3, but when he did it. When there were slave rebellions and slave owners, enslavers were scared that it was going to happen to them. So I talk about that in the book too. So I think I was trying to say that by all accounts, meaning we don't have all accounts. You know what I mean? So.
I struggle with that though, like the humanely and like even when we talk about the history of Thomas Jefferson, right? And with Sally Hemings and that relationship. It was a man who was enslaving a young woman. And I hear people say like, oh, but he loved her and it was a loving relationship and it was romantic, like all of that, which can humane and slavery even be within the same sentence, really?
I don't think so. And this is, I think, one of the most pervasive and difficult myths we need to dispel in American history and get past. I don't think as a society we can move forward unless we deal with a lot of the mythologies that are in our society, that are in our heads. And this particular one, I mean, you quoted Key earlier about the freedom suits. The rest of that quote, Key describes himself as a benevolent slaveholder. So this is his self-view, right? I mean, in other words, the evidence, the testimony we have about whether Key is a benevolent slaveholder or not comes from Key himself. So that's one thing. And he says that while he manumitted most or nearly all enslaved people he personally held. His father-in-law was the largest slaveholder in Maryland, right? And he continued to enslave people who he said were too old to take care of themselves. He portrayed that as an act of benevolence, right? And so I really think we've got to get past this myth of the benevolent or humane slaveholder, whether it's Jefferson or Key or others, and it has had many afterlives, particularly in Gone with the Wind, and it needs to be dismantled. We need to pull it apart, and the only way to do that, I think, is to tell different stories and to be more truthful and honest about where we're receiving that depiction from, where that story comes from.
When you say tell different stories, you're talking about including
Right.
different stories. Yeah.
Right. We can't ask the people Key enslaved whether Key treated them humanely. And the evidence that we have about this whole subject, in many respects, comes from the Federal Writers Project, 1937, ex-slave interviews across the South, many of which were conducted by white interviewers asking specifically a leading question of formerly enslaved people to prompt an answer that, and for formerly enslaved people in the 1930s being interviewed by a white government paid federal worker about their experience, they're going to tell them what they want to hear, you know? And so historians have really worked hard on this over the last 20 years to try to look at, this is why like account records are so important, or records beyond Key's letters, records that start to show the full extent of enslavement and what it meant. And so I think we need more stories and to see the reality of slavery, that the idea of the humane slaveholder is a self-justifying idea for those who held slaves.
Mark.
Yeah.
In chapter 8, entitled "The Anthem of Black Lives," you examine society, and now we have 2 more questions before we open it up to Q&A. Is that okay, Nora? We're good? Okay. In chapter 8, she is the president, y'all. In chapter 8, entitled "The Anthem and Black Lives," you examine society's response to Key's original line in the Star-Spangled Banner: "No refuge could save hireling or slave from terror of flight or gloom of grave." Now, this was a time when Black people were basically fighting on the side of the British to liberate themselves. So there was that. But through your research, can you share the historical context and varied interpretations of this line? And I'd love to open it up to the panel to respond as well. And I've heard an interview that you gave from like a linguistic standpoint, interpreting, so if you could. Yeah.
So yeah, the line is, "No refuge could save the hireling or slave from the terror of flight or the gloom of the grave." And in the book, I sort of go through 3 possible readings of that. One is the reading, which is that the word slave refers to the colonial Marines, who were really valuable Black fighters who fought on the British side. They were self-emancipated Black men who were offered passage by the British to safety in Canada or was it Trinidad? Was the other one?
Yeah.
And many families, I think, took them up on that offer, but they also had the opportunity to volunteer to fight for the British. They didn't have to, they were offered the opportunity. And the same offer was made in the Revolutionary War, and the British didn't follow through with actually liberating the men who fought on their side, but in the War of 1812, they actually followed through on that. And these fighters were very helpful because they knew the terrain and they knew the Chesapeake Bay region in a way that the British regulars did not. So slave could refer to them, and I think anyone who was an abolitionist or who was black at the time reading this would have probably had that reading. I also explored two other readings, which are a little shocking, but they're based on the notion that you're in a white supremacist society that assumes everyone is white. And that is a use that's actually quite common of the word slave in American patriotic poetry from the era of the Revolutionary War. And in this case, the word slave refers to actually a white citizen of the United States being subject to King George. So if you are subject to a king, then you are not acting of your own free will, and therefore you are enslaved to the king. And so in that reading, hireling means you're a paid mercenary soldier, and slaves mean you're subject to the British king, as opposed to the American soldiers who were free militia volunteers, right? So they were not being paid, and they were also fighting of their own free will. There, of course, were also paid professional soldiers in Fort McHenry as well. The third reading, which I look at, is, to my mind, one thing that Francis Scott Key himself might have had in mind, which is that what's interesting about that phrase is that it's in the singular. No refuge could save the hireling, singular, and slave. So it's not, no one could save those hirelings and slaves, referring to a group, but actually a singular person. And one of the interesting bits of information that Francis Scott Key got while he was aboard the ship and writing his lyric was the death of Major General Robert Ross, who was the sort of hero who was leading the Marines on the British side. This is the gentleman who had ordered the burning of the federal buildings in Washington, D.C. This is the gentleman who had imprisoned Baines, who he had come to release. And this was the sort of hero and the sort of the motivator, the person who gave the British troops courage. And he was killed by an American sniper as they approached Baltimore. And so the fact that he died was maybe one of the reasons the British retreated rather than taking on Baltimore, which would have been a very difficult fight. They probably would have won that fight because they were professional soldiers. But unlike Washington, D.C., the resistance in Baltimore was quite organized. They had trenches and all sorts of defenses. So Francis Scott Key had actually heard that Robert Ross had been killed, and that, in fact, in the effort to get him emergency medical care, that he had been put on a litter and then sort of rushed back to the shore to try to get him some medical help, and he actually died on the way. So it's possible that the sense no refuge could save the hireling and slave could refer to Ross as a subject to the king and as a paid soldier, but also that he experienced the terror of flight and the gloom of the grave, because he's the one person that Key knew because of the liaison of Skinner back and forth with the British command. He had heard that, oh my gosh, you won't believe this, Robert Ross was killed. So I think Key had been really disillusioned about the British when he was aboard ship. He, his uncle had studied English law, had actually fought on the Loyalist side in the Revolution. His father had been on the American Revolutionary side. But Key himself idealized the British. He was a Federalist politician, and that whether you're pro-French or pro-British sort of defines American politics in this era, and Key was definitely on the pro-British side. So the fact that he would be on the British ship and hearing about their plans to destroy Baltimore really disillusioned Key, and he writes about that in one of his letters right after. So those are the three possible readings of the word slave. But I just want to emphasize that understanding the word slave as referring to a white male citizen subject to King George is not to say that, oh, this is okay now. This is not a racist society. It's rather only possible if it's so racist that you could use the word slave when there were actual human beings that were enslaved, and be so myopic and so centered on the fact that only white men had political power in this era that your patriotic lyric was only talking about white men. It wasn't talking about women, it wasn't talking about African Americans, because in terms of the political unity that Key was trying to instill, they didn't count.
Can I just add one quick thing, and I agree with Mark. Then there is the last line of the Star-Spangled Banner. the land of the free and the home of the brave. The free, I mean, that's the last sentence of my book. There are 5 million enslaved people when he called us the land of the free, right?
Yeah, and that's not an irony that gets lost on abolitionists, right? So some of those hundreds of alternate lyrics are actually abolitionist lyrics that are based, a land of the free, question mark, really? A home of the brave? And there's a very powerful lyric written by an abolitionist minister actually from Battle Creek, Michigan, which has this powerful line where it says, you know, the American flag is flying at the half-mast of freedom, the home of the slave. And that's the final line in that lyric.
I will say, reading your 3 books from a musicology perspective to the autobiography of Francis Scott Key. Biography, excuse me. That would have been you.
Yeah,
not
there.
Francis Scott Key. My bad. Okay, the biography of Francis Scott Key to those that were impacted by his work and his own biases and prejudices. It was a really powerful dialogue and conversation. My last question is for William. In your book, A Question of Freedom, you write, because we all live inside stories of family, of community, of nation, and because we blend and shape our stories into mythical narratives, only when our narrative is revealed as broken, as ruptured, as somehow incomplete, are we able to interrupt its authority in our own lives and form a different narrative drawn from different stories. Can you share with us how St. John's College, founded in 1696 in a city that was once a major slave port, a city that was a site of lynching and racial terror, a school to students like Francis Scott Key who would have a lasting impression on American democracy. Can you share the benefits and possible let's just stick with benefits. The benefits for St. John's of examining and sharing their relationship and history with Black communities in Annapolis?
Right, wow. Well, that's an extraordinary question, and the question for this community, and for the college, and for the city, and for all of us in the audience here, and all of us up here. I guess I want to.
Can I re-say that? I mean,
Yeah.
I just want to say that.
I'll be very brief. But
Yes, yes. Can you share the benefits of St. John's? I'm just going to keep it all the way real. Can I keep it real with y'all?
Yes.
All right. Can you share the benefits for St. John's to examine their racist past? And making, specifically the work that they're doing with their archives and making this accessible to the public.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely. So, first of all, the benefits are, as I see it, are, research and teaching, right? This is a college. It's meant to educate people for the future. And we do that through inquiry, through investigation, through research, and through teaching, through education, through mentoring. And placing this question at the forefront of that endeavor strikes me as all to the good at a college like St. John's. The second benefit is acknowledging this history. If we can repair what's broken in history, what's missing, right? If we can repair our history, I think as an institution, a college, as people who are part of that institution, we can repair ourselves. There's something broken in ourselves. There's something that needs to be reconciled here. And a part of that is connecting with descendants of families who've been part of this story, part of this community, but have been excluded from its history or excluded from its self-understanding. And so the benefit of this work is a renewed understanding of what the St. John's College community is and who is part of that story and part of that community. And to do that, recognizing that history, bringing it forward, honoring it, and institutions are doing this, memorializing that history symbolically and in the traditions of the college in ways that make sense for this college and this community. And so I think those are the benefits I see. It's about not just about reckoning with a painful history, it's about reconciling ourselves and reconciling our history with our vision of the mission of in this case, the college.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Would you gentlemen like to add to that, or would you like me to open it up to Q&A?
I mean, the only other thing that I would say is I've met several fantastic students today being on campus, and many students of color, including some students who present as African American. And one of the things I think that doing that history and having that repair starts to open up the possibility that we can welcome other people to St. John's and say, this is a place for you too. And this wasn't always a place for you, but now it is, and we want you here, and we value you, and we need your voice and your intellect and your brilliance to make this nation what it should be and to live up to those ideals of the land of the free and the home of the brave. Sometimes, I think the question for me is sometimes in that line is, do we have the courage to actually do the work to be the land of the free or not? And I think one of the things that takes that courage is to admit that the past is not something we're proud of, and that we actually, I mean, I know for my sake that I was raised in a way that made me blind to a lot of these same issues. And so there's a real humility and a real sense of admitting that you're broken to be able to be repaired. But that there's such a value to that having happened. So it is about us, but it's also about everyone in the future and, in a sense, the others who've been left out.
So you all have historians, a journalist, music expert on the stage, okay? So don't be shy. If you have any questions, if you can say it from your seat, or you can come to the mic. I see one hand raised. And the second one. Carl, you ain't got no questions? Not yet? Okay.
Oh, the mic right there. Got it. Yeah. Turn it on.
Okay, well, so I'm David Townsend, I'm an ancient tutor at St. John's, and I just want to thank all of you for trying to think about what we are as a, does that work? Yeah. Trying to think about what we are as an American institution and what it means to be an American institution. So I just want to thank you all for that. I also want to question the way that it seems to me, sitting and listening, that this problem is being framed. And what I hear is an either or. What I hear is there were good guys who were abolitionists, and there were bad guys who were slaveholders. So the abolitionists historically did not end slavery. And I'll speak a little bit for Frederick Douglass, a great Marylander. And Douglass, who started off on the side of Garrison, and the abolitionists, understandably so, changed his mind and realized that Garrison and the self-righteous, virtue-signaling abolitionists were causing more problems. And so he changed and became the party of the Union. So what you're saying, it seems to me, about Francis Scott Key is that he recognized early that the Union, the Constitution, was the way to end slavery. You could virtue signal and say those guys are evil
and we're just going to separate all the virtuous people from the evil people. But what actually happened was that there was a return to the Constitution. Garrison was standing on street corners and burning the Constitution. And Frederick Douglass said, "You're wrong. The way out of this is to read the Constitution and to use the law. It is not a slave document." And I would say that Douglass, who then befriended Lincoln, and who was instrumental in getting 250,000 black troops, right, to fight in the Civil War, which turned the tide. That was the answer to the question. So I just think the framing of the good guys, who were the abolitionists, and the bad guys, who were pro-slavery, I just question whether that's the best way and the most honest historical way to think about what it is to be an American. It might be that you have to make it a little more difficult, and you got to stand up and fight for what you believe, like Frederick Douglass, and not just virtue signal.
I just want to say one quick thing before you all take off. It's important to note that when we think of abolitionists, it was black people that were the early abolitionists. Oftentimes when we think of abolitionists, we think of white middle-class folk who were passing around pamphlets and working legally to, or through revolt to free African Americans. But the people who were early abolitionists were the black people who resisted, self-liberated, such as individuals like Frederick Douglass, to liberate themselves. So I just wanted to frame it in that way, but go ahead.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think one of the things I've come away with from my work, and I was not focused entirely on Francis Scott Key, but I was trying to understand who this guy might have been who wrote the anthem text, that there really are no good guys and bad guys, that's a false dichotomy, and that as we try to read back through history, if we separate people into good guys and bad guys, we come up confused, in part because a lot of white abolitionists were not looking for equality, right? They did not have an ultimate read of the Constitution as the land where all men were created equal, right? And similarly, a lot of slave owners claimed that slavery was evil. So if you read the rhetoric, they'll say, oh, it was evil. It's a necessary evil, but it's evil, right? So if you just look at the rhetoric, it doesn't get you very far. But my personal reading with Key often is that there's things that sort of are unimaginable today because they seem to fall on both sides of the ledger. And in part, I think that's a pretty normal status of being human and maybe being American in a way. I mean, one of the things that I found really telling was that with the Francis Scott Key Bridge disaster, the 6 men who died were all of Hispanic origin, right? And they were all immigrants to this country. And on one hand, that says that working construction is actually a pretty good paying job, and it's something that's open to immigrants, and people have opportunity there, and that's probably a good thing. On the other hand, it sort of shows that there's another group of people who are doing the labor late at night that make the world comfortable for the privileged, people like me. And I think in a way, we have our own question of freedom and equality that's still being asked of us today. And a big mistake, I think, about coming to a conclusion about the past is the willingness to not pay attention to the present. And I think there's lots of reasons why the same questions we ask of people like Key, we need to ask of ourselves. And are we actually the advocates for freedom and equality that we want to be remembered for in 200 years?
Yeah, I agree. I didn't approach this book at all with the idea of either or trying to discern good or bad with people like Francis Scott Key. Instead, what I want to do as a historian is really see how people navigated and negotiated their legal and political and social world. and to try to have the reader immersed in the complexity of that world. And one of the things that I found in doing this work, it's interesting you bring up Frederick Douglass because he's right in the introduction to A Question of Freedom. The same point you helpfully made, that slavery is, he says, when he's addressing the Garrisonians in 1851 and 52, when he breaks with the Garrisonians, he essentially not only reclaims the Constitution, that's one of the key parts of my book, but he also says slavery is not lawful, okay? And I really thought about that issue because as gradually I pulled apart the arguments in these freedom suits made by black families here in Annapolis, the Queens and the Mahoneys, two of the most significant freedom suits in American history, when you look at the legal arguments that are being made, they cite and go to 2 centuries of English precedent about this question. Now, that blew my mind, that since the 1670s, English courts, the King's Bench in London, had been deciding cases about whether there's human property, whether slavery is legal, whether an enslaved person can be collateral on a mortgage or a debt, right? And all these cases that are brought into the Maryland court right here in Annapolis show us that whether slavery was lawful or not had been debated in English and American courts for 2 centuries. And that judges had a role in determining the outcome of these cases. But what I was really interested in is, how people navigated that highly complex, variable social, political world so that we can understand ourselves, we can draw from that to think about how do we navigate our own highly complex social and political world that we're faced with today. So nuance is, I think, what I'm interested in as a historian.
Thank you. We have another question, and I just want to say I was picking on Carl Snowden. We all know who Carl Snowden is, right? He is a civil rights activist. He is the chair, convener of the Caucus of African American Leaders in Anne Arundel County, and they have proposed that, and they are championing the renaming of the Francis Scott Key Bridge to be renamed Perrin Mitchell, who is a notable civil rights activist. And if you want to learn more about Perrin Mitchell, you can come to Banneker-Douglass Museum. But the second question, we have a question back here, and then we have a question in the audience. And I know, do we have any questions online? Shout out to our Zoom family. I don't know if we're using Zoom, but sure. So let's go with that, Adrian, and then we'll go with the person in the third row.
So the question reads, the term structural racism is used often today, but seems even more obviously appropriate to Key's time and indeed to many of his own actions. Yet the word has not been used once in this panel except at the very end. Is it largely inappropriate here? If so, why? Not an abolitionist, brother-in-law to Tawney, doesn't focusing solely on him obscure the assumptions of his world? Looking for particular exceptions, like whether he was nice to his particular slaves, is hardly the point, as the speakers express. Rather than looking for connections with the subject of Key as this panel began, isn't it surely at least as important to find and highlight disconnections? What suggestions would the speakers have for highlighting such disconnections in seeing Key? Should I read that again?
It's okay.
No. You guys got it? Okay.
Go, yeah.
I mean, I think the term structural racism would be appropriate in this context. I mean, I think I meant, when I was sort of talking about white supremacist ideology, I was maybe talking about a similar thing. You know, in terms of, I do think, well, I have to think about the disconnection, to what extent we're, I mean, I do think we have to sort of see that as it is a different time. It's a time when slavery is somehow legal in the United States, and where the Constitution has sort of been bent to and compromised the ideal of freedom in order to bring slave states and free states together. But I think it's a provocative question. I'll need to think about it some more. I don't know if anybody else wants to comment on it.
Well, I think the conversation was around the shaping of structural racism. Yeah.
Right. So there's definitely structural racism in this period, and definitely we would say there's structural racism in law and other social institutions, the church, education. At the same time, I think what the freedom suits revealed to me is the ways that people resisted structures that were designed against them. Enslaved people use the law that allows freedom suits created by enslavers, and use courts and use legal mechanisms through the law, despite the structurally racist position of law in 1793, to not just navigate, but secure their ends, what they wish. Now, so that's the, you know, when the questioner asked about disconnections, that's where I see a whole range of stories and important history that we need to work on, and we need to include in our teaching and in our thinking about this entire period. So there's more out there, examples, but I want to be careful to suggest that even within structures that are defined as racist and racializing, people navigated through those and resisted them within them. So those stories are important.
I can say one quick thing. Yeah, well, you know, people have asked me over the years, what did I think of Key, you know, as a human being? And so I thought about that in context of this structural question. And what I've always thought was, I mean, I think I mentioned piety, right? He was piety, he was patriotic, but, you know, he was also conservative in the fact that, not the way we think of conservatism today, but just, he was more like establishment, which would be the structure, you know? Mm-hmm. I mean, he was a straight guy. He did what he had to do based on the system that he saw in front of him. So he was, yeah, that's the way I see it in that context, so.
Thank you. Third person with the cool tie. All right.
Well, first I want to say I am blown away by you guys. This was one of the most excellent presentations I've seen.
Thank
and
you.
especially to the moderator.
Yeah.
Those were incredibly insightful questions that you asked these gentlemen. So, well,
They were really hard, too.
I thought so. I thought they were. So I'm not going to make too many comments, although throughout this whole thing I kept thinking, oh, I want to comment on that and thing. But where I was going to go was where Mark, and I've read both of your books. Sorry, I haven't read yours yet, but I've read yours, and name is Lou Giles. I'm a volunteer docent at Fort McHenry, so I've done a lot of research on my own, just like you gentlemen. I've read the letters of Key and Polly Lloyd. You talked about that a little bit, but I think you can't dismiss the role she played in his life. She was his opposite in so many things. She came from a huge slave-owning family. She was not very religious at all. And so that played a role in his life. But what I'm torn with, I think I would agree with most of your facts, except I come out a little bit kinder to Key, I think, than you gentlemen. And you discussed on an issue of benevolence, benevolent slaveholder. And some of the facts with Key, though, or at least that, are that in several instances, Key would purchase slaves from slave markets so that families wouldn't be separated. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? And he would take them up to his plantation and find jobs for them. So I could argue it's both ways, right? Is that good or is that bad? Also, for many of the, and I think one of you gentlemen talked about this, for slaves who worked at his plantation in Frederick, in many cases, when he manumitted them, he would hire them. And he would only manumit them until he was convinced, at least in his mind, that they could make a living for them and their family on their own. Again, benevolent, not malevolent. So if you would comment on those, thank you.
Can I add something just real quick? I know I'm not a panelist, but so when this conversation and exploring Key more deeply than I ever have, this question of morality comes up a lot. Of is it good? Is it bad? Is he a good person or a bad person? And if we can all agree that morality changes over time. And I think it kind of, at times, for me, it almost like flattens the conversation a little bit, where maybe it will kind of, we can have more of a critical discourse when we talk about how power is wielded generationally, and then also how power and oppression operates generationally, like that examination of it. Because you could have multiple truths. You could be a great father, you could be a great husband, but you could also be incredibly abusive to other people. And so their stories, those that were abused, also matter. So I think it's not about putting a moral cast on Key per se, but examining how his role and his power shaped and impacted others, that their stories weren't really told until like 2 minutes ago, or recently in the last 10 years. So I just wanted to, when I say told, I mean within the public domain, right? Go ahead.
Yeah. So in a question of freedom, Key comes into the story only when he appears in the lives of the black families who were suing for freedom. So, and his role is exactly that, like where does he intersect in their lives? So I'm really not, as a historian, thinking about weighing some moral judgment here, or about is any particular historical figure good or bad or moral or not. That's really not that's not something that as a historian I'm trying to analyze or present. I understand though the impulse, right? As we read history, we want to sort of put individual historical actors on some kind of scale. But I want to be clear, right, that as a historian of this period, number one, I'm not doing that and resisting it at every turn. And instead, I want you, as a reader, to sort of confront the Key that shows up in the story. If it's not the heroic Key you were expecting, well, it's the historical actor in his context and where he is positioned relative to the other people in this history, right? And so, just asking the question, and last point on this, when I was talking earlier about the myth and the problem of the benevolent slaveholder, which you've raised, I'm speaking in American history terms, in the broadest sense of this, not with regard to any individual historical actor, but the way we culturally are part of and reading and hearing and seeing these larger myths that operate in our society. And I think, there's no question that this idea is operating in American society in ways that and that we need to get past it. That was my point. But with regard to an individual person like Key, I'm not really assessing some sort of moral scale. I'm really trying to put him in his context, and it all depends what the position is, right? Because he comes into people's lives at different points, and their story is not the same as his story. So,
I can comment a little bit. So I had the pleasure of speaking at Fort McHenry this past summer, and for me, in some ways, that was a kind of, professional high point. And part of what I struggle with, as Will is sharing, is that I have a deep relationship with this song. I love this song on some level, enough, and we all love these topics enough to dedicate countless hours and years of our lives to these questions. And I think it's very hard as a historian to keep your emotions out of it, because you also have to stay up late at night and spend countless hours checking footnotes, and it's a labor of love in a certain way. And I think, part of my love for that song and for Whitney Houston's version and Jimi Hendrix's version is wanting to feel that somehow that song can be a force for good. And the sense that Key is this corrosive figure is hard for me to wrestle with, right? And I do think in certain ways that, when I'm looking for sort of the attempt to understand, I do think about the fact that, Key freed the first enslaved person in 1811, so 3 years before he writes the Star-Spangled Banner, right? And it's this young girl who, and there's very little information, at least that I've been able to find about these things. So you don't know what his motivation is, what the circumstances were. There's also, there's a lot of, in terms of the legal terrain, I think Will's point about the fact that ground is shifting underneath this whole history. Like, there's all sorts of rules about how you can free people, and in Virginia, it's illegal just to let people go, right? Because they don't want people to be free, right? So they're making that really difficult for people who want to, manumit slaves to do so. So I think sometimes, and I try to think of myself and today, the fact that we do have evidence of Key struggling with this or being on both sides of the ledger is sort of remarkable in its own way, because I think a lot of us sort of live our comfortable lives and we don't really go either way, right? You can't really tell. I think there's two things, I guess I would say. One is that for a lot of Key's speeches and rhetorics and the quotations, the fact that he was so devoted to the American Colonization Society, I sort of read everything he says as propaganda. I don't know if we could ever find out what Francis Scott Key believes morally. I think he himself is, because the Colonization Society attempted to create this middle ground between abolition and slavery, and that's an impossible space, right? So the only way to be in that space is to go through these incredible sort of linguistic contortions, right? So the fact that he says all these weird things that don't make sense are partly because he's advocating for this organization that sort of doesn't make sense. So where is the real Francis Scott Key in that story? I have sort of no idea on one level. And so I think it's really hard to know. The one thing I can say about Key, when I want to think a good thing about him, wow, he freed this person, or he did give training to those he'd enslaved before he released them so that they would have a chance of making a living, and that he seemed to care not just about freeing people, but the fact that they were treated well, and they could live a good life. You can sort of think that. But ultimately, Francis Scott Key also sort of never made the personal financial sacrifice to hurt himself in favor of any of these people that he owned, right? They were always situations that sort of he could be held harmless, and he did ultimately sort of bend his own or compromise his own view of freedom to allow the status quo to continue, that no landed person, no wealthy white person would get hurt by this. He sort of had this imaginary view that maybe that slavery could be ameliorated in individual cases without actually addressing the fundamental problem. And I think that's a little bit about what Will's getting at, and where we struggle with these sort of moments of seeming benevolence, like the fact that he cared so much about families being split up, and he talks about that a lot. And that was a terrible thing, right? We can say that's an awful thing to take husbands and wives and people from their kids and to sell the most valuable young men and the father into the Deep South, right? Because the other thing that's changing the ground is the cotton gin, right? So slavery like shifts radically to the Deep South, and you know it's hard to say that people could be bought and sold at all. So, but you could make a lot more money selling them into the South, right? So that was a factor that changed the ground underneath Key's feet in a way that made these freedom suits sort of, they became increasingly less successful, right? Because basically the law decided we didn't want freedom to happen, and as abolition rises and the sort of tension within the country rises, the judges stopped deciding in favor of African Americans.
I just want to say one thing. You know, when you immerse yourself in someone's life, using for 2 years or however long it was that I did it, and I thought about him every day, and through the sources that were available to me, right? And you're trying to get as many primary sources as possible. And while you're not even thinking about it, there's some kind of alchemy, right? Somewhere along the line, you get in your head, you know, your impression of him or your feel for the man based on everything that you can. And it's not, you know, there are contradictions in everybody. And part of my job, I feel, as a biographer, is to just lay it out there, right? I mean, and I do, and I let the facts sort of speak for themselves. So.
We have one more question.
Absolutely. How can you turn that down?
We do. Yes, go ahead, Carl. Yeah.
First, I want to thank the college for holding this. This has been really an interesting discussion. But I got a recommendation for you guys and those in the audience. There's a movie called The Imitation of Life. It's written back in the 30s. And it's an incredible movie. And it talks about benevolence. I really want people to understand. And I'm going to give the short version of this. It's really important. This white couple has a black maid, and they spend countless time together. At some point, the black woman is dying. And this white couple, who was benevolent, who thought she was doing all the right things, when the black woman said, I'm dying, but there's some last minute things I want to do to get my life together. And she started telling her the various things she wanted to have done. And the white woman responds, I didn't know that. I didn't know you did this or you did that. And she said, the reason you don't know, you never ask. It's important, and I told Dick Hillman this earlier, that people tell their own story. The narration is important. I had this great opportunity, and it's going to lead to a question. I had this great opportunity to meet Rosa Parks here in Annapolis. And I tell this story because it's so powerful. In 1984, at First Baptist Church. And this small, demented woman who was part of history and somebody had read about it, never met, came and told her story to this packed church. And at the end of her telling her story, a reporter from the Capitol asked her the following question. Mrs. Parks, he said, why did you refuse to give up your seat in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama? And this woman, in this very quiet voice, said, sir, you're wrong. I did not refuse to give up my seat. I refused to give up my dignity. People who interpret history, have to listen to those who lived through it. The great debate that's going on now is, as we look at institutions, as we look at people like Francis Scott Key, how should we honor them? Should we honor them at all? Statues are coming down. People are rethinking how we should honor people. So my question to the historians, those of you who studied the life of Francis Scott Key, this debate that's going to take place here in the General Assembly, hopefully next year, is whether or not we should rename the Francis Scott Key Bridge, based on what we know and those things you have shared with us. So I'd like to get each of your individual opinion on whether you believe that we should rename it, and if you do, why, and if you do not, why not?
And you can't abstain.
I abstain. I knew this was going to come up. Yeah.
Since Carl and I discussed this earlier, I'll go first. I think it should be renamed. I think the bridge is a symbol, a gateway. It's viewed from so many different places around Baltimore and beyond. It stands there symbolically, and its name, therefore, is invested with a great deal of meaning and should tell us something about the society we are as a whole and the society we hope to be. And I think, you know, we are at a point where we need to really think about our memorial landscape, the symbols, what we honor in our institutions and in our cities and in our civic places and in our roadways, waterways, and schools. And I think it's an opportunity right now to really think hard about that, about who could we honor that has not yet been honored and whose story has meaning to us today in a way that enlivens that gateway to Maryland and stands symbolically to that gateway of Maryland today and Maryland to come. And so I think it's an opportunity.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mark.
I might break a tie. I don't know.
Well, for me, I think the name that a community chooses for that kind of symbol really has more to do about where the community wants to go than where it's been. And so I actually don't lament the change. I mean, I think the world is changing and our hopes and dreams are changing and our awareness is changing. So to me, it seems quite appropriate actually to think again about what the name could be and sort of charting a new kind of beacon that would point a way forward. So I think there's no doubt that Francis Scott Key and the city of Baltimore will continue to be associated with. I do think there's a power to memory, and I think there's a power to remembering that Francis Scott Key's era and that time, and that's not something that should be erased. But that's a totally different thing in my mind from what we choose to memorialize and what we choose to be the kind of model for our kids and future generations about where we want to go. So I think the robust discussion in some ways is maybe more valuable than the result, but that the result people should be comfortable letting go of what had been tradition and not see that as a threat to their own personal identity, and sort of open up to the possibility of moving forward in a different direction.
My turn?
Your turn.
Yeah. Well, no, I think the word opportunity that Will said, I think the horrible thing that happened there's an end here, and now there's a new beginning. And with a new beginning, I think it's totally appropriate that someone more representative of the community, that bridge should be named after.
So we're gonna.
Is it okay? It's relevant.
Oh.
We're gathered here today.
So no one can hear you who's not
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Sorry for extending this a little longer. I just think the idea of renaming doesn't really do justice to the purpose of why we're gathered here today. Because really at the, sorry, I'm gonna be a little passionate, but at the core of it, really we're DEI efforts, and true DEI efforts are really about dismantling power structures. And a name isn't gonna change that. A name doesn't change a landscape. A name doesn't change a history. A name doesn't change generations of inequity, right? And so really, I was on the History Task Force for 2 years as a student representative out of Santa Fe. And I just thought there was always more that we could do than just discussing the people, right, who have impacted our identity and our heritage. St. John's forever, right? So I'm really curious, like, how can we actually say this is an end, the death of an era, right? The death of, what maybe we could say like apartheid America or something like that. If we're not really addressing dismantling the power structures and instead focusing on renaming power structures while those power structures stay the same, right? And a lot of what we talked about on the diversity or the history task force was, how do we move forward? Do we ask for an endowment for scholarships for some of the families? And I mean, obviously the answer is yes, and we do that work. We work on grants to support this work, the archival work, so that the stories that were untold and were erased really do, come to the forefront and allow us to address, our history. But I also think, do we end there? What more do we do, especially St. John's, who has a 300-year academic history in the United States associated with the slave trade, or at least located in a place of high slave trade? And I say this specifically because the academic institution is inherently a racialized system as well, right? And so if we're not really addressing the identity that St. John's has outside of just raising our DEI quota of a more diverse student body, or talking about, do we bring a more diverse curriculum, and that's highly contested. Do we get away from the Great Books program that has 2,000 years of history behind it, right? But mostly white males behind it. So I'm just really, I think, I don't have a direct question, but it's how do we do—
There's a question in there.
Yeah, how do we do more, right?
And if I may,
yeah.
You lucky that was a good question, because I was really about to end this panel. But so the first step of, if I may, before, okay, it seems like the university is in a state of the beginning stages of truth-telling, and the question of, okay, now that we have this truth, now that we examine this truth, how do we go about restorative practices, reparations? What does that look like? And that is something that we did not unpack in this panel discussion, but I encourage the university through its work to have that as their aim, for sure. So, to the panel.
No, I mean, thank you for raising that question, and I think it's profound, and it's one of the things that changing a name doesn't end the story, right? I mean, this has got to be continuous work, and it's going to be work that continues to expand, right? It's the question, the sort of black and white question, is in some ways is the thing we struggle with in American history, and when we're talking about Arab Americans and Asian Americans, I mean, there's such a broader landscape that we have to acknowledge and struggle and embrace. Indigenous rights, I mean, I think one of the things that I've come to understand about this work through struggling with the Star-Spangled Banner is that it doesn't really end. I mean, there's this question of what does it mean to be free is used as such a kind of, I don't know, on one hand as sort of a talking point in American history that gets employed for all sorts of political purposes without a lot of introspection, but it's ultimately this question about how do we expand and make that word true for more people, and answering it today is not going to answer it for tomorrow and is not going to answer it the day after, but asking the question every day is probably the path forward. So just renaming the bridge doesn't solve the problem, but I think all of these things are part of the solution, and we have to sort of do them all.
What he said.
Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, and there was a beautiful lady in the back. I'm so sorry I missed your question, but we will, if you have any questions, we got the panelists, so you can run up to them, mob them after this discussion. Please give yourselves a round of applause for being with us tonight. To St. John's College, the students, your great questions, comments, and the work that you're doing around historical research. All right? Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chanel. Big round of applause for our moderator, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Memorialize the moment. That's right.